Okay, welcome to the video. So I thought today I'd talk about something that's been much in the news, at least in my part of the world, and that's this alliance that was signed on the 6th, between the 6th of this month, between Australia and Fiji. This alliance that's called the Ocean of Peace Alliance. And now, obviously, this is an alliance between two countries, Australia and Fiji, but the intention is that many other Pacific countries in the South Pacific region will join the alliance. That's clearly the expectation. It's been the Australians and Fijians have said so, and this is why it's been much in the news in this country, because the question is, shall New Zealand join? And there's been a chorus of people coming out and saying that we should join. In fact, there's an article, I think it was in The Conversation, saying that New Zealand must join. It's absolutely imperative that New Zealand joins this alliance. The New Zealand Prime Minister has come out and said that New Zealand should join as soon as possible. Just in passing here, this strikes me as one thing that was very odd about all of this, is that people are talking as if they didn't know that this was happening. I mean, it's like Luxon and others they didn't know that there were talks going on between the Australians and the Fijians, and this has completely hit them out of the blue. Or at least that's how they're speaking. It can't be true, can it? But anyway, that just struck me as odd. Anyway, I want to focus on something else anyway. What's the point of the alliance? Well, actually, it's not clear to me what the point of the alliance is. I think everything I've read says one thing, but I think that the answer might be something else, or at least the alliance could become something else. So in all the stuff that I've read, the newspaper articles and this online discussions and so on, there's all the standard guff about, we live in a volatile world and, we need to get into alliances of this sort in order to deal with the volatile world that we're living in. And actually, this just made me stop and think for a minute. Is it actually true that we live in a more volatile world than we have? I guess it depends. It depends where you are. I mean, I'm not sure everyone in the world would think the world's more volatile now. I think maybe for us it is, right? But there are plenty of parts of the world that haven't exactly been quiet for the last 30 years. But okay, it's more volatile for us. Okay, I guess I can accept that. But it just did strike me the extent to which what we're seeing here is Western elites really freaked out at the moment. And you think, what is it that's freaking them out? They didn't seem all that freaked out about the war in Ukraine, although they tell themselves lies about what's actually going on there. But they still are telling themselves lies about that. So it doesn't seem to be Russia that's freaking them out, and in a sense, it doesn't seem to be China either. I mean, what's China doing that's so incredibly new now? I don't know, that people just notice again how unspecific people are about this. People will say things like, China is exerting itself, it's becoming increasingly aggressive. And you think, well, okay, doing what? What exactly has changed? Okay, there was a missile test last week, but maybe I could talk about that at a different time. I think that was a bit unfortunate, the way that happened. But, missile tests aren't actually as rare as one might think. They just don't get reported very much. Anyway, my take on this is that Western elites have actually been really freaked out about Iran. That really surprised them and has caused a bit of a panic in the international relations world, right? And that's why we're seeing these kinds of impatient and slightly frazzled responses. We must join an alliance. We must do it straight away. We must do it immediately. It's a panic. Like there's a bit of a panic in the air. It's also partly a beat-up, I think. A beat-up designed to get us to agree to spend more of our taxpayer dollars on weapons. And I might just say it, just at a time when we can little afford that. Just at a time when all our economies, Western economies, are extremely weak. Now we're supposed to be spending all this extra money on weapons. Anyway. Let me just, again, get to the question. What's the point of the alliance? Well, the general assumption is that the alliance is anti-Chinese. And if you read the newspaper articles and so on, that's what's said. It's an anti-Chinese alliance, though that has been denied by the Fijians and the Australians. They denied that, but then they would deny it, right? Now, my own guess is that different people have, and this is not surprising, it's always like this, different people have different ideas about what the point of the alliance is. If you ask the Australians, they probably don't have the same view about the point of the alliance than the Fijians. There'll be a lot of commonality, but there'll be important differences as well. But I'd just say that if indeed the alliance is anti-Chinese, then I think that it will fail. And in fact, it's likely to be counterproductive. It will fail because the Chinese just are going to have an influence in the South Pacific for reasons that I'll touch on in a minute. And if what's the Fiji and Australia are trying to create here is a sort of a solid block of countries in the South Pacific that reject China, it's not going to work. The Solomon Islands already have a relationship with China, and there are other countries that will have. And as long as they get 2 or 3 of those countries in the region developing relationships with China, and then the whole alliance will, it won't cease to exist, but it will be toothless. It'll be meaningless. I also think it's counterproductive because if it really is an anti-Chinese alliance, that gives China a reason to get more involved in the South Pacific, right? If you're going to have if you're trying to set up an anti-Chinese alliance, that gives China a reason to get in there and make sure that the alliance doesn't succeed. Right, of course, the Chinese could just say, who cares about the South Pacific? That's possible too, right? But if they're at all worried about it, they might think, oh, well, let's get in now. Let's make sure that this alliance doesn't succeed. And I think they would likely be able to pull that off relatively easily, because developing relationships with the Chinese is likely to be very attractive to Pacific Island states, because the Chinese, when they come with lots of money, right? They invest large sums of money in the countries that they develop relationships with. And, we're talking about countries that really need investment. And so they're likely to find relationships with China extremely attractive. And it's to be noted that the text of the alliance, the Ocean of Peace. I find it hard to say that. It's a bit of a, like all these things, I suppose they have portentous names. The Ocean of Peace Alliance doesn't prevent countries developing a relationship with China. It's very short. It only took me like 2 minutes to read the treaty. It was a little bit difficult to find, actually, but it wasn't certainly not difficult to read. There is a commitment to democracy, which is a little bit odd, given that we're talking about Fiji and its history. But there is a commitment to democracy in the treaty. But that's the only thing that you could read is in any way directly anti-Chinese. Of course, there might be a subtext, as it were, but the content of the treaty doesn't prevent people developing relationships with China. And now, on the subject of money, it's to be noted that the Australians went to Fiji with money. They've agreed to invest $1 billion Australian dollars. That is, the Australian government will invest $1 billion Australian dollars in Fiji over the next 10 years. I just wonder how Australian taxpayers think about that. But anyway, that's the game, right? So the Australian government recognised that in order to compete with the Chinese, they have to come along with money. But the thing is, the Australian government can't compete with China when it comes to this. And certainly the New Zealand government can't compete. There are suggestions in the New Zealand Herald that I read recently that New Zealand should start accepting this money from the Chinese in order to fund our infrastructure in New Zealand, given our government for decades now has proven to be so useless at providing infrastructure funding. Anyway, so if the alliance is in fact anti-Chinese, then my guess is that it will fail and is likely to be counterproductive, because it will actually encourage the Chinese to get involved in the region. It's also, although it's said in all of these articles that the target of the alliance is China, one thing I'd just ask you to notice, as I pointed out in previous videos, that there's no proper analysis of the threat. China isn't the name of a threat, it's the name of a country. China doing something, right, might describe a threat. But there's no analysis of that. China doing what? I mean, if, for example, and I'm not suggesting that this is credible, right, but if it was China invading us, then the alliance is completely useless, right? I mean, what difference does it make whether, so for example, to Australia, whether it has an alliance with Fiji or not? What difference does that make? I mean, no offence to the Fijians, but really, in the scheme of things, the Fijian military is irrelevant, right? And so now, okay, there are other threats, even potential, even hypothetical threats than being invaded. But okay, what are they? They need to be spelled out so you can work out whether the alliance is a credible response to the actual threats that exist. And I think it's very worrying that we never get this analysis. We're just told that China is a threat. We're not told China doing something is a threat. And that indicates to me that what's going on is serious threat inflation. Right? Yes, of course China could do things that would damage us in various ways, but whether they'd want to is another matter. I mean, they could nuke us, for example. Well, why would they want to do that? Right? We need to be realistic about what the threats are, and none of the articles that I've read this year have, in any of, say, New Zealand or Australian newspapers, have been at all realistic about this. If I've missed something, please let me know. I'd be interested to read it. Another thing to point out is that the key article from a defence perspective, Article 6 of the treaty, the mutual defence article, is a bit weak. It says, each party recognises that an armed attack on any of the parties within the Pacific would be dangerous to each other's peace and security, as well as the security of the Pacific, and declares that it would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its domestic processes. So, I mean, that's definitely not a guarantee militarily to come to each other's aid in the context of an attack. But that, the people have said, that's a bit weak. But I think that's a bit of a red herring. There aren't treaties that require military intervention. Even the much vaunted Article 5 of the NATO treaty does not require this, despite what you constantly read. You're constantly told that Article 5 of the NATO treaty is a watertight article that means if one country in NATO is attacked, everyone in NATO will have to respond militarily. But that's not what Article 5 says at all. What Article 5 actually says is that the countries must give assistance to a country that's being attacked. But what it must do is, to quote, it must take, quote, such action as it deems necessary, right? Which may involve military force or it may not, right? Anyway, so I think that's a bit of a red herring. But the point is that, look, if it's anti-Chinese, it's just not going to work. Okay, now, it might not, however, be anti-Chinese. The point of despite what you're reading in the newspaper, the point of the alliance might not be anti-Chinese, or even if it currently is anti-Chinese, it might become something different. And what I want to tell you now is a story from my past about this. It happened in a tutorial when I was an undergraduate at university and studying, amongst other things, politics. And I think this was in 90. Would it have been 89, 88, something like this, 89, 88, something like that. And at the time, as it is now, New Zealand was considering replacing its fleet of frigates with some new frigates, and we were debating this in the tutorial. Should New Zealand do this? And I, being the kind of political, I was a pretty cliche undergraduate, and at the time have rather different political views now. But at the time, I just had this sort of standard undergraduate university student type views, and I thought, no, we shouldn't be buying frigates. There's no point, blah blah. Now I think we shouldn't be buying frigates, but I have a different reason for it. Then I thought it was pointless, and the reason I thought it was pointless was, well, one of the reasons I thought it was pointless is because then, of course, the big enemy was the Soviet Union. And I said, what's the point in having, I think it was 4 frigates we were going to buy? I mean, 4 frigates against the Soviet Navy, and 4 frigates, they've got one gun on them each, as opposed to the the weaponry. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's pointless. I said, if what we're trying to do is keep the Soviet Union out of the South Pacific, buying 4 frigates is a complete waste of money. And then in response to this, my tutor said something that was very interesting. Something that's really stuck with me. She's very good. I can't remember her name now, but she was very good. She said, the point of buying the frigates is not to keep the Soviets out. It's to keep the Americans out. And at first I thought that was crazy. I mean, what? You know, for a start, how could 4 frigates keep the American Navy out of the South Pacific? But anyway, they're our friends. They're our allies, right? That's crazy. It's, you know, we're not buying frigates because we're anti-American. And then she explained, no, that's not it. You don't get it. It's not anti-American. We want the Americans out of the South Pacific, but we don't want to be anti-American. Okay, now let me explain. Let me tell you what she told me. She said that the fact of the matter is that the small island countries in the South Pacific, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, these countries, they want to be visited by warships. It's very important to them that they get visited by warships. And it's also important to some degree that they get to send their militaries out visiting other parts of the world. I think this is particularly important for Fiji, given the status of the military in Fiji. So these countries want to be visited by warships. Now, I don't actually know why exactly, but, you know, it makes them feel secure, she said, but I don't know why it would make them feel secure, but okay, I can believe it. Maybe if you know more about this, maybe you can put something in the comments, and because I've spent, whatever it's been, 30 years since then, more than that probably, trying to figure out why they would care. But apparently they do, right? And the thing is, if New Zealand and Australia, if we couldn't send our ships to visit their ports from time to time, they would ask the Americans. And the problem was, it's not so much that we didn't want Americans in the South Pacific per se, it's that if the Americans got more heavily involved in the South Pacific, then the Soviets would feel that they had to get more involved as well. So in other words, the point of keeping the Americans out was not anti-American, it was to demilitarize the South Pacific. Now, it's a little bit odd here, right? Because you have to buy weapons in order to demilitarize the South Pacific, but it does make a certain amount of sense, right? So if we didn't have any ships to send to Fiji, they would invite the Americans in, and if the Americans got really involved in the South Pacific, then the Soviets would feel that they needed to, I don't know, develop relationships, well, like the Chinese are doing now, develop relationships with countries to build bases, maybe, whatever. Whereas if we buy some ships, then we can keep the level of military in the South Pacific as low as possible. Okay. All right. So the point is to keep this, the point of buying the frigates then, at least, was to keep the South Pacific demilitarized. Right, it's a little bit oxymoronic, but I think you can see it makes a certain amount of sense. So the idea is that this alliance, the Ocean of, and notice the name, right? Okay, the name could mean anything, right? War is peace these days, right? So, but the name is the Ocean of Peace Alliance, and that suggested to me that the idea is not to form another Western anti-Chinese alliance. The point is to create a grouping that says to the world, we don't need your weapons here, right? We don't want your weapons coming here. We have an ocean of peace, and we've all agreed to this. It's a bit like the nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific. Right? This is an ocean of peace, right? Please don't send your weapons here, right? We don't want to become part of your conflict. So it's not anti-Chinese or anti-American for that matter. We just don't want to be part of the conflict between the Chinese and the Americans. Now, if that's what the Ocean of Peace Alliance is, or if that's what it could become, then it would have my support. Right? But there's a big problem here. There's a really big problem here, and it's these guys. Right, as Australia, because the two countries that kicked off the alliance are Australia and Fiji, and Australia is a very problematic country in this regard. As Australia gets deeper into AUKUS, it being the largest country in the alliance, it's the largest country by far, of course, in the so-called Ocean of Peace. right? As it gets deeper and deeper into AUKUS, that will mean that the Ocean of Peace Alliance will become deeper and deeper into locked in with the West. And it will, whatever the intentions of the small Pacific island nations or New Zealand, it will naturally make the alliance appear anti-Chinese. And I think there's a lesson here for Australia. You can't have it both ways, right? If you really do want an Ocean of Peace alliance, if that's, you actually mean what you're saying there, then you can't be an AUKUS at least not in the form that AUKUS is, buying attack submarines to hunt down Chinese submarines and so forth. If you're in an anti-Chinese alliance with the United States and with the United Kingdom, then you can't be in a demilitarizing alliance in the South Pacific. That's just not going to work. And from a New Zealand perspective, we have a real problem here because our closest ally, Australia, seems determined to make enemies with our and their largest trading partner with whom we need a good relationship. And we've got to figure this out. How are we going to deal with that? Until Australia has made up its mind about what its future direction is, I think we need to be very careful about jumping into alliances of this kind, directly contrary to all the panic that you're hearing in the media. We need to be careful about this because we may end up in a system that undermines our national interest rather than promoting it. So I think we need to be careful before jumping into alliances of this kind, though we won't be. We won't be careful. Nobody apart from me and I guess people who watch this show, none of these people want to be careful. They all want to jump into these alliances as quickly as possible. I think it's a disaster waiting to happen. Anyway, I'd be very interested to know what you think about that. So please do leave a comment, and thanks very much for watching.